It all started with a man who believed his heart had shut down for good and a woman who had nothing left but two trembling daughters and the kind of quiet bravery it takes to knock on a door the world had long forgotten. What happened in that worn-down shed wasn't just about making it through the night. It was the first flicker of something extraordinary, something that, years later, would come full circle. If you find meaning in quiet strength and love sparked by small acts of grace, consider sticking around. These are the stories we share because sometimes it only takes one moment to change everything. Now let me show you how it all began. The wind roared through Montana Valley like an old song only Henry Whitaker still knew by heart. Snow had powdered the bare fields outside, clinging to the splintered fence posts and naked trees like sugar dust on abandoned gingerbread. Winter had arrived early that year, and it looked like it was planning to stay a while. Inside the modest cabin, everything was where it belonged. The wood was stacked neatly by the door. A coffee mug, chipped at the rim but still strong, sat beside the kettle. And above the mantel, a faded photo of a woman with soft curls and bright eyes gazed out, untouched by time. Henry's eyes lingered on it as he bent to lace up his boots. The leather was scuffed and well-worn, but still carefully maintained, like everything else in his world. Another cold one, he murmured to the empty room. Pulling his coat tighter around him, he stepped into the biting wind, his breath rising in small clouds. The daylight was thin and cold, the kind of morning that didn't offer comfort. He made his way toward the shed behind the house. It wasn't much, just a lean-to his father had thrown together decades ago. It had stored tools, sacks of grain, and once years back, a litter of puppies his daughter had pleaded to keep. That was before the accident. Before everything went quiet. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he neared the door. Something wasn't right. The latch, which he always fastened from the outside, hung slightly open. Frowning, Henry reached for the handle. The metal was icy against his fingers. He eased the door open slowly. What he saw rooted him in place. There, curled against a pile of hay, was a young woman. Thin. Her coat was barely holding together, more stitching than fabric. Her arms were wrapped tightly around two little girls, maybe 5 or 6, huddled beneath a worn army blanket like kittens hiding from the cold. Her damp hair clung to her forehead in stringy clumps. One of the girls had a thumb tucked into her mouth, her face hollow and pale. The other clutched a one-eared stuffed rabbit. Henry's first reaction was instinctive fear. He wasn't used to visitors, much less complete strangers. But as he stood there, something deeper surfaced. Older. A memory. His wife placing a hot mug of soup into his hands during a storm. His daughter quietly leaving her gloves behind so a man on the street could stay warm. His mother's voice echoing in his head. Kindness is its own kind of shelter, Henry. He cleared his throat softly. The woman stirred and blinked up at him, her eyes rimmed red. I'm sorry, she said quickly, trying to get to her feet. We didn't mean to trespass. We'll go. Just needed to get out of the wind. Her voice faltered at the end. She was trying hard to sound strong, but Henry could see it plain as day, her knees were trembling. She hadn't eaten in days. The kids hadn't either. That much was clear. Hold on, he said, raising his hand. Don't get up. Just stay right there. Without another word, he turned around and headed back to the house. He didn't glance back. Words had never been his strength. But warming a kettle? That he could do. Inside, he grabbed the leftover chicken soup from the night before and poured it into a pot. He lit the stove beneath it. The recipe was his mother's. Honest, filling, and simple. Chopped carrots, potatoes, garlic, and rich bone broth with just a touch of thyme. This time, he added a bit of milk just to stretch it. 10 minutes later, he returned to the shed with a tray balanced in his hands, 3 steaming bowls, a flask of clean water, and a wool blanket. The woman was sitting up now, her daughters tucked close on either side. Henry didn't say a word, he just set the tray down in front of them. The girls stared at the food like they were trying to remember what a hot meal even smelled like. It's not much, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, unsure. But it's warm. The woman looked up at him, eyes shining, not just with exhaustion but something else. Gratitude. Maybe even disbelief. Thank you, she whispered. The girls didn't wait. One took a bite, then made a small sound, a mix between a sigh and a sob. Tastes like heaven, the woman murmured. Henry had no idea what to say to that. So he just nodded, stepping back a little, letting the moment be what it was. After a beat, he asked, "What's your name?" "Clara," she said softly. "And these are Sophie and Mia." He gave a small nod. "Henry Whitaker." Clara reached out, not to shake his hand, but to rest her fingers against it for just a second. A simple touch. One that said, "We're real. And so are you." By mid-morning, the steel-gray sky had faded into a softer, silvery hue. Snow drifted down in slow, silent spirals, cloaking the earth in a fresh, soundless layer. Inside the farmhouse, warmth had started to creep back in, not just in temperature, but in feeling. The air didn't feel so hollow anymore. Henry stood at the window in the kitchen, watching as Clara helped her daughters out of the shed. Their coats didn't match and weren't nearly warm enough, but they smiled as they clutched her hands. Their cheeks had the faintest blush of color again. They looked better. He turned back to the stove, poured hot water into 3 mugs, and stirred in spoonfuls of powdered cocoa. The good kind, the kind he'd kept in the back of the pantry for visitors who never came. Clara was the first to step through the door, gently, like she didn't want to break the calm that had settled. Henry had already laid out towels, a pile of clean socks, and a flannel shirt that once belonged to his daughter. By his best guess, Clara was about the same size. He was pretty sure no one had touched that shirt in years. The twins followed close behind, their eyes wide as they took everything in. Sophie, the bolder one, pointed to the mounted antlers above the fireplace. "Is that from a moose deer?" Henry gave a quiet smile. "Big one." Mia stayed close to her sister, half hidden behind her scarf. Clara guided them gently toward the couch, then turned to Henry. "We didn't mean to barge in," she said. "The truck died about 6 miles back. We tried walking to town, but the girls got too tired. I spotted your shed and thought maybe we could just get out of the wind for a while." Henry nodded slowly. "Well, sounds like you found more than just wind out there." Clara let out a breath that might have been a laugh. Cracked a little halfway through. "Yeah, we did." He handed her a mug. "Cocoa? You didn't have to." "I know," he said gently. "But I did." She took the mug in both hands like it was something sacred, breathed in the warmth before sipping. And for the first time since she'd walked through his door, she looked less like a stranger, and more like someone who belonged. The girls didn't say much. They curled up under the heavy quilt, sipping quietly, but kept sneaking glances at Henry like they weren't quite sure he was real. Clara stared into her mug for a moment before speaking. "I used to work as a CNA at a hospital back in Billings. Then my husband walked out, took the car, drained the account, and left us with nothing but a broken-down truck and whatever hope I had left." She paused, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Hope doesn't last as long as a tank of gas," she added, almost to herself. Henry listened quietly. He didn't interrupt, there was no need. He understood more than he could ever put into words. "My girls deserve more than this," Clara went on. "I've been doing everything I can to give them something better, but—" Her voice shook. This wasn't how it was supposed to turn out. Henry's reply came soft and steady. "No, it rarely is." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with meaning. Still, heavy. Then Sophie, curious and wide-eyed, pointed toward the fridge. "Do you live here all by yourself?" Henry nodded. "Where's your wife?" she asked innocently. His jaw tensed slightly. Clara looked like she might step in, but Henry raised a hand to stop her. "She passed," he said plainly. "Some time ago." Sophie's eyes dropped to the floor. "I'm sorry." Henry gave her a small, warm smile. "Me too, sweetheart." After a brief pause, he made his way back into the kitchen, letting instinct guide him as he reached into the pantry. "You thinking about heading back to Billings?" he asked over his shoulder. Clara hesitated. "I don't know. I doubt the truck's going to start again. I was planning to walk into town, ask around. Maybe find a shelter." "There's no shelter in town," Henry said, shaking his head. "Especially not this time of year. Closest one's about 40 miles out." She didn't respond right away, but he could feel the weight of that truth settling in the room like a fog. After a moment, he spoke again. "I've got an extra room. Nothing fancy, but it's warm. If you need a couple nights to catch your breath, you're welcome to it." Clara blinked, surprised. "You really don't have to." "I know," he said again, more gently this time. "But the offer's real." She studied his face for a few seconds, like she was searching past the lines and whatever she saw there, it must have been enough. "All right," she said quietly. "Just a night or two." "That'll work," Henry said, reaching for his toolbox. "You get settled in. I'll go see if I can make sense of that truck." Clara's smile wasn't bright, but it held something stronger. Trust. When Henry stepped back out into the cold, the wind cut through his coat like a blade, but he barely noticed. Something had changed, taken root inside him. He didn't know exactly what it was or what it might become, but this much was clear. The shed wasn't empty anymore, and neither was he. The next morning, the sky was dull and heavy, veiled in gauzy clouds. Outside, the snowfall had lightened to a gentle dusting, but the wind still whispered against the house like an old ghost reluctant to move on. Inside, though, it was warm. Henry stood at the stove, slowly stirring a pot of soup. Breakfast soups weren't his habit, too many memories of cold mornings spent alone with leftovers and silence, but this morning felt like it asked for something different. He'd found half a bag of egg noodles in the pantry, chopped up some carrots and celery, and tossed in the last of the frozen chicken. The scent rising from the pot carried him back to long-forgotten Sundays, back when the house had been louder and life had felt fuller. At the table, Clara sat with Sophie and Mia. Their cheeks were rosy from sleep and warmth. Mia, still quiet, leaned gently against her mother while Sophie tapped her spoon on her mug, humming under her breath. The sound wrapped itself around the room like a song the walls hadn't heard in years. Henry set 3 steaming bowls in front of them, then took a seat across the table, folding his big hands in his lap like he wasn't sure what to do with them. "You cook like my grandma," Sophie declared, scooping up a spoonful and giving it a dramatic blow. "Oh yeah?" Henry said, raising an eyebrow. "She used to make soup every morning even when the sun was out. Said it was good for warming your heart?" Henry let out a small chuckle. "Well, sounds like your grandma knew what she was doing." Clara gave a soft smile as she helped Mia with her spoon. "Thank you," she said gently, "for all of this." Henry gave a quiet nod in return. He'd never been great with words, but doing things? That he understood. Fixing fences, cutting firewood, cooking up something simple. Saying little, showing much. After breakfast, Henry grabbed his coat and pulled on his gloves. "I'll go out and take a look at that truck of yours," he said. "Could be something fixable." Clara looked up from drying Sophie's hands with a dish towel. "Are you sure?" Henry shrugged with a half-smile. "Not like I've got anywhere else to be." In the light of day, the truck looked even worse than he remembered. The hood was dented, the windshield cracked, and the rear tires were nearly bald. He lifted the hood and winced at the sight: rusted clamps, cracked hoses, tangled belts. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. It would take more than tools and determination to get it running. But he'd try. He owed them that much. Back inside, Clara was at the sink, rinsing dishes. The girls were on the floor nearby, giggling as they built towers from a set of old wooden blocks, ones Henry had saved since his daughter was little. An hour later, Henry returned, wiping his grease-covered hands on a rag. "How bad is it?" Clara asked, turning from the sink and drying her hands on a towel. He leaned in the doorway. "Starters completely gone. Radiators leaking like a sieve. Honestly? You'd need a mechanic and a couple $100 in parts, at least." Clara's shoulders slumped. "Yeah," she said quietly. "That's what I figured." "You're welcome to stay a little longer," Henry offered. "At least until we figure something out." Clara met his eyes. There was a question in her expression, unspoken but clear as day. "You don't owe me anything," he added quickly, sensing it. "I've got the room, and it looks like you could use it." Clara gave a slow nod. "Just until I can sort out a plan." That afternoon, the girls helped Henry haul firewood in from the porch. Sophie attempted to carry a full-sized log, staggered under its weight, and ended up dropping it at his feet while laughing uncontrollably. "You've got grit," Henry said, tousling her hair. "She's convinced she's a lumberjack," Clara called out from the doorway, teasing. "Am not," Sophie declared, planting her fists on her hips. "Are two?" Mia murmured through a giggle, hiding her grin behind her hands. That night, the 4 of them shared a simple stew by the fire. Henry had made it, his quiet specialty, though he'd never call it that. Clara helped slice the onions and filled the kitchen with stories from her days working as a CNA, veterans who cracked the same old jokes, nurses who danced in the halls just to lift someone's spirits. Henry listened, more amused than he expected to be, watching how her face lit up when she talked about taking care of people. But when the conversation shifted to why she left it all behind, her voice grew softer, her gaze more distant. Later, after the girls were tucked into bed beneath thick quilts and makeshift pillows made from Henry's old flannel shirts, Clara lingered by the fire, cupping a warm mug between her hands. "I honestly don't know what we would have done if you hadn't shown up," she said quietly. Henry kept his eyes on the fire. "You've got it backwards. I didn't find you. You found me." Clara glanced over, tilting her head. "I mean, this place has been quiet a long time," he said. "Too long. And then you 3 came along and brought noise back. I didn't realize how much I'd missed the sound of life." Clara's smile was soft, barely there. Her hands stayed wrapped around the mug of tea as the fire crackled gently between them. Eventually she stood. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Clara." The door to the guest room clicked softly behind her, but Henry stayed by the hearth, eyes locked on the glowing embers. He thought about the sound of his daughter's laughter, the echo of his wife's voice, the warmth that had once filled this house. It didn't feel like the same place anymore. It felt like something was coming back. By the fourth day, the snow had started to ease. Water trickled from the edges of the roof, drumming lightly into the tin buckets Henry had placed just in case. It was the kind of day that hinted at change, though it didn't promise anything just yet. The air smelled like thawing pine and old memories. Inside, Henry was at the counter chopping carrots while Sophie and Mia sat nearby, coloring and quietly chatting in soft voices. Clara stood by the sink, drying dishes, her quiet humming threading through the background like a melody only the house could hear. For a moment, everything felt easy. It felt like family. And that, Henry realized with a sudden, tight feeling in his chest, was dangerous. The illusion shattered that afternoon when Ruth Carter showed up. Ruth, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who ran the feed store in town, had a habit of letting herself in through the gate whether invited or not. This time was no different. She came bearing a bag of cracked corn for Henry's hens. He met her on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning, Ruth." She peered past him, her eyes narrowing at the sound of laughter from inside. "You've got company?" Henry nodded. "Just lending a hand to someone for a few days." Ruth arched an eyebrow. "Someone? You mean that woman and those two little girls?" "Their truck broke down near the edge of the property," he said calmly. She crossed her arms. "And you don't even know them?" Henry shrugged. "Don't really need to." "You always were soft," she muttered, though not unkindly. But there was a shadow of concern in her gaze. "Just be careful, Henry. You've got a kind heart, and that's how people get hurt or taken advantage of." He met her eyes evenly. "Sometimes people don't need judgment. They need a little help." Ruth didn't argue further. She handed him the sack of corn and gave one last warning before heading back down the path. "Keep your doors locked, just in case." When Henry stepped back inside, he found Clara sitting rigidly on the couch, her jaw tight. She had clearly heard enough. "I'll pack up our things tonight," she said without looking at him. "We'll be gone in the morning." Henry blinked. "What?" She stood, brushing her hands down the front of her sweater like she was smoothing something that wasn't there. "We've overstayed. People are starting to talk." "Henry, I'm grateful. Really. But I can't be the reason folks start whispering behind your back." He took a step toward her, something uneasy rising in his chest. "Let them talk." She shook her head. "It's not about pride. It's about what's safe for you, for the girls, for me." The room stilled. The only sound was the slow, ticking rhythm of the old clock above the mantel. Henry sighed, voice low. "If you truly want to leave, I won't stop you. But you don't have to go." Clara didn't answer. She simply turned and walked down the hallway, gently closing the guest room door behind her. Dinner that night was quiet, too quiet. The girls picked at their food. Mia leaned into Clara's side, while Sophie sat unusually still, her lips pressed in a firm line. After the table was cleared and the girls were tucked in, Henry sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. He remembered another kind of silence, the kind that settled in after his daughter came home from school crying over cruel words about her worn-out shoes. His wife had wrapped her in a blanket, poured cocoa into a chipped mug, and whispered, "We don't live by their approval, sweetheart. We live by our kindness." Kindness. That's what had brought Clara to his door. And somehow it's what had brought Henry back to himself. He got up, walked quietly down the hall. The door to the guest room was cracked open just a sliver. Inside, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, folding one of his old flannel shirts, carefully, almost reverently. "You really don't need to do that," Henry said softly from the doorway. She looked up, startled. He paused, leaning on the frame. "And for the record, you're not a burden." Clara offered a faint smile, tight around the edges. "Maybe so, but it still feels that way." Henry stepped further into the room, rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to work out a thought. "You know," he said, "when I lost my wife, it felt like the whole world just ended. I kept going, day by day, but it was like trying to breathe underwater. Every minute was just getting through to the next." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes shining with emotion. "But these past few days," Henry's gaze dropped to the worn carpet beneath his boots. "They felt different. Like I was finally living again." Clara let out a slow breath. "Yeah, me too." The space between them grew quiet. Not heavy, just full. The kind of silence that carried weight without pressing down. "I don't know where this road leads," Clara admitted. I'm just so tired of picking up the pieces and starting over again. Henry's voice dropped to a softer register. Then maybe you don't have to. Not yet. Her eyes brimmed as she looked away, blinking fast to keep tears from falling. If you still feel like you need to go, Henry said gently, I'll understand. But if not, you're welcome to stay. As long as you need. Clara gave a small, wordless nod. Just once. But it was enough. The next morning, Henry walked into the kitchen to find a folded note waiting on the counter. It was scribbled on the back of a torn grocery list in soft, looping handwriting. Thank you for giving us more than shelter. Thank you for giving us peace. Clara. Next to it sat the flannel shirt she'd carefully folded the night before and a tiny pair of knitted mittens. The house was quiet. Henry stepped out onto the porch expecting to see tire tracks leading away. But instead, he spotted Clara and the girls in the shed packing their things and laughing as they worked. They hadn't left. And somehow that meant more than any words they could have said. The smell of bread rising drifted through the cabin like a quiet hymn, soft and warm, like Sunday mornings from long ago. It had started when Sophie asked if they could bake cookies. Henry checked the pantry and realized the sugar was almost gone. Still, he scratched his chin and said, well, I've got flour, yeast, salt, and just enough honey. Clara tilted her head curiously. Bread? He shrugged. Haven't made it in years. But I still remember the steps. What he didn't mention was that the recipe had been his wife's, written in faded ink on a yellowed index card hidden behind the spice rack. He hadn't looked at it in over a decade. Could hardly read her handwriting now. But his hands still knew what to do. Warm water. A pinch of salt. A spoonful of sugar. And time. Now, as the dough slowly rose in the cozy warmth of the kitchen, the girls sat at the table with flour on their cheeks, debating whether the loaf deserved a name. I think we should call it Fluffy, Sophie declared, arms folded with conviction. Mia wrinkled her nose. You can't name bread. That's just weird. Says the girl who named her shoes, Sophie shot back. Clara laughed quietly and gave Henry a gentle nudge with her elbow. This, she said, voice full of warmth, this is what peace sounds like. Henry smiled, eyes still on the oven. Yeah, it's been a long time. They moved together through the kitchen in quiet rhythm, working side by side. Clara rolled out a second batch of dough while Henry lit the oven. Their shoulders brushed once and neither of them moved away. Later that morning, while the bread baked, Henry and the girls headed outside to clear the walkway. The snow had started to pull back, revealing streaks of mud and damp patches of grass. Sophie, of course, turned the chore into a snowball fight, flinging handfuls at Mia, who shrieked and ducked behind Henry's legs for cover. Hey, he called out, swatting snow from his coat with mock seriousness. This ain't a war zone. Mia giggled. You're the snow shield. Henry raised his shovel like a knight preparing for battle. Then I shall protect you, Lady Mia. Clara stood on the porch watching them, arms crossed and a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The sunlight touched her face, softening the fatigue in her features. For a brief moment, she didn't look like a woman carrying loss. She looked like someone who was finding her way back. When the bread finally came out of the oven, the scent was nearly overwhelming, rich, nostalgic, almost holy. Henry sliced the first loaf with care. Steam curled up from the crust like a quiet blessing. He slathered butter onto thick slices and passed them around the table. The girls took their pieces with a kind of reverence, biting in and humming with delight. Fluffy is perfect, Sophie said through a mouthful. Henry chuckled. Well, if the expert says so, I'll believe it. Clara accepted her slice last. But she didn't eat right away. She just held it for a moment, staring at it as though it held something sacred. My grandmother used to bake every Saturday, she said softly. I haven't smelled this in years. Henry glanced at her, then down at the bread, then back again. Funny how a smell can bring it all back. She nodded slowly. Sometimes I think I've forgotten what home even smells like. But today. Her voice faded off into quiet. Henry didn't push for more. He didn't need to. That afternoon, they spent time cleaning out the shed together. What had once been a place to store tools had become a second living space, a playroom for the girls, a quiet nook for Clara. They swept out the dust, patched a window pane, and hung old quilts on the walls for insulation. At one point, Clara spotted a small wooden box hidden behind a loose plank in the wall. She pulled it free and opened the lid. Inside was a pair of antique salt and pepper shakers shaped like tiny birds. Were these yours? She asked, turning them gently in her hands. Henry stepped over and shook his head. No. Those belong to my daughter. She used to collect things like that. Clara didn't ask anything more. Instead, she carefully wiped them clean with a cloth and set them on the kitchen windowsill, giving them a new home without a word. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Clara stayed up alone in the kitchen, slowly flipping through an old cookbook Henry had dug out from the back of a cabinet. The pages were yellowed and stained with butter and thyme. "You've got a lot of good things here," she said softly, not looking up. "Things that matter." Henry leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed loosely. "There was a time I believed none of this really meant anything," he said. "Not when there was no one to share it with." Clara lifted her eyes from the cookbook. Their gazes held across the low light of the room. "Henry," she said softly, "I want you to understand this hasn't just been kindness. It's been healing. For all three of us." He swallowed, his throat thick. "You've brought something back, too." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" He didn't reply right away. Instead, he nodded toward the kitchen table where the bread sat cooling, where a scattering of crayons and empty cocoa mugs remained, where the quiet no longer felt hollow. "You brought life back into this house," he finally said. "I didn't even notice it was missing." Clara lowered her gaze, blinking away the tears beginning to gather. "I'm not asking you to stay forever," Henry added, his voice gentler now. "But if you wanted to, you could. For as long as you like." They didn't say anything else for a while. Then, without a word, Clara closed the cookbook and ran her hand across the worn cover. "In that case," she said with a faint smile, "I guess I better learn your wife's pot roast recipe." And just like that, something shifted between them, unspoken but solid. Not a promise. Something deeper. A beginning. The days slowly grew longer. Not by much, just a little more light stretching into the evening, but enough for Henry to notice. Enough to keep him lingering on the porch a bit longer after feeding the chickens, watching the horizon fade from gray into soft lavender. Inside, Clara helped the girls fold laundry in the kitchen. One of them dropped a sock, then another. Laughter floated out through the open window, gentle and familiar, mixing with the scent of fresh soap and old wood smoke. Henry stood there with a cup of coffee gone cold, but he didn't mind. Some things, he thought, were better left to steep. Still, a quiet unease stirred in him. Not exactly worry. Just restlessness. He'd started to memorize their rhythms, the way Mia clung to Clara's sleeve when she felt unsure, how Sophie insisted on carrying firewood that was clearly too heavy, the way Clara hummed while she swept, always a different tune but somehow always in the same key. And that, he realized with a sudden pang, was dangerous. Because these small, ordinary pieces had settled into the shape of his days far too easily. Too easily. That evening, while the girls colored quietly at the table, Clara stood at the stove stirring stew. She wore one of Henry's flannel shirts, it draped over her frame, the sleeves rolled up, the collar soft around her neck. He'd noticed her borrowing his clothes weeks ago, but he never said a word. Somehow it felt right, like turning on a porch light just in case someone might come home. "How long's it been since you left the hospital?" he asked, breaking the stillness. Clara looked up. "Almost a year. I left when everything started falling apart. I was afraid the girls would come home to an empty house one day." Henry nodded slowly. "Do you ever think about going back?" A crease formed between her brows. "Sometimes. I miss it. The feeling that what I did mattered to someone." "It still matters," he said softly. She glanced at him, uncertain. "What does?" "What you're doing now. For them. For this place." His voice didn't have much confidence behind it, but it was honest. Clara offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not the same." Henry didn't argue. He knew exactly what she meant. Even the good things can feel like they're not enough, especially when you've lost more than most people ever know. The next morning, Henry was outside splitting wood when Clara stepped onto the porch with an envelope in her hand. Her face was unreadable. "This came in the mail today," she said. Henry wiped his hands on his jeans and took it from her. The envelope was thin, the address carefully printed. "Clara Elmer Merritt. It's from the Regional Health Center in Bozeman," she said quietly. He looked up at her. "I applied for a job a while ago," Clara explained. "Didn't expect to hear anything, but they offered me a full-time position. CNA work. It comes with housing. Decent pay." Henry felt a sudden pinch deep in his chest, sharp and silent. That's good news," he managed. Clara nodded once. "Yeah, it is." She didn't say anything more. And neither did he. That night, something in the house felt different. Still, but not peaceful. The girls picked up on it, though they didn't say a word. Clara packed quietly, in small ways. Folding their clothes with extra care. Gathering shampoo bottles and toothbrushes into Ziploc bags. Henry didn't ask if she needed help. He didn't know how. He stayed in the living room instead, staring at the fireplace that hadn't been lit, watching the shadows move across the walls like echoes of things he didn't want to remember. After the girls were asleep, Clara came to sit beside him. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and settled onto the floor at his feet. The silence between them stretched wide, like a bridge with no one quite ready to cross. "I don't want to leave," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at her, his heart knocking hard against his ribs. "Then stay. It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because this place, it isn't mine," she said. "This home. This life. It's yours, Henry. And I don't know where I belong in it." Henry leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You think I have it figured out? You think I know where I fit anymore?" Clara gave a small, tired laugh. "I've already lost everything." "Clara," he said, voice firm but kind, "I lost my wife. My daughter. The rhythm of what life used to feel like. And then you showed up, unexpected, uninvited, and suddenly this place didn't echo the same way anymore." She met his eyes. "But I'm scared," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. "Because if I let myself care again and you walk away." He paused, swallowed hard. "I don't know if I could survive losing that too." Clara reached up and gently rested her hand over his. "I'm scared too," she admitted. They sat there in that shared silence for a long time, neither needing to say more. Eventually, she rose to her feet with a soft sigh. "I just need a little time," she said. "A few days to sort things out. To figure out what's best for all of us." Henry gave a slow nod, not because he wanted her to go, but because he cared about her enough not to stand in the way. The morning they left, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Clara didn't offer a dramatic farewell. No long goodbye or lingering glance. She simply hugged Henry at the bottom of the steps, whispered a quiet thank you into the collar of his shirt, and then helped Sophie and Mia into the old sedan parked beside the shed. Henry had spent the last 2 days getting that car running again. He hadn't meant to, he just couldn't help himself. And now the engine hummed quietly, ready to take them wherever Clara thought they needed to go. The girls waved from the back seat as the car pulled away. Henry lifted a hand, but his feet wouldn't move. Then they were gone. And just like that, the quiet returned. But it wasn't the same silence he'd lived with for years. Not the kind that used to feel like peace. This quiet pressed in around his ribs, sharp and heavy. It reminded him, in every little corner of the house, that life had once filled these walls. And now it didn't. That afternoon, Henry drifted through the rooms without purpose. The kitchen still carried the faint smell of Clara's rosemary biscuits. On the couch, a small mitten remained stuck between the cushions. And on the fridge, a crayon drawing was still pinned beneath a magnet, 3 stick figures holding hands. Above it, in a child's uneven scrawl, "Us and Mr. Henry." He stood there for a long time, one hand on the fridge handle, heart aching in a way he hadn't let himself feel in years. He tried to keep busy. Cut some firewood. Patched up a section of broken fence. Fixed the leak in the shed's gutter. But everything he did felt empty, like he was just pretending to live someone else's life. That night, he lit a fire in the hearth and poured himself a cup of tea. Not cocoa. Cocoa was for visitors, for warmth and laughter. Tea was for solitude. For silence. The wind began to whistle beneath the eaves again, just like it used to. Before Clara. Before the girls. Before their voices had made this house feel like home again. He missed them. God, he missed them. And what hurt most was how quickly he'd come to rely on having them there. The next few days, Henry moved through the house like everything was normal. But the walls told a different story. The guest rooms sat exactly as they had left it, undisturbed except for the flannel shirt Clara had folded neatly on the pillow. The girls' boots, too muddy to pack, still waited by the back door. The dish towel hanging from the oven handle bore faint, floury marks from Sophie's first attempt at kneading dough. On the 4th morning, Henry stepped into the shed. It smelled like cold wood and emptiness. He stood there for a moment, staring at the straw-covered floor where they'd first appeared. He could still see the way Clara had looked up at him that day, tired, scared, but proud. He could still picture the girls, curled together like kittens, holding onto each other in sleep. One small act of kindness, he thought. That's all it took to change everything. He sat down on the same overturned crate they'd once used as a makeshift bench and let the stillness close in around him. And then he cried. Not the muted kind of grief he'd buried after his wife passed. Not the dull ache he'd learned to numb with chores and time. These tears came fast and open, raw and unforgiving. The kind of tears that clear out space in a man's soul. He wept for the years that had slipped through his fingers. For the hope he hadn't dared to hold onto. For the love he might have missed if he let it go now. And when the crying finally stopped, he didn't feel hollow. He felt present. He felt awake. The next day, the storm came sudden and furious. Rain slammed against the windows like fists. The wind bent the trees. The sky turned dark and bruised like it had taken a beating from within. Henry rushed outside, yanking a tarp over the firewood, fastening the barn doors, securing the shutters. And then a flash. Lightning tore through the sky with a deafening crack. He spun around just in time to see it strike the corner of his workshop. In seconds, it ignited. Flames leapt upward like they'd been waiting for permission. He ran. The grass was slick beneath his boots. Smoke burned his eyes. He grabbed the hose, but the water line was frozen solid again. He snatched up buckets, filled them from the rain barrels, flung the water at the flames, but it was no use. Within minutes, the fire had devoured everything. The workshop, his hand's purpose, his past, his quiet refuge reduced to ash and heat. He stood there in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone, panting, helpless, watching it all collapse in fire and ruin. The neighbors showed up too late. Blankets were draped over his shoulders. Quiet condolences were offered. Someone asked, "You got insurance?" Henry nodded, voice hoarse. "Not enough." That night, the wind howled like a wounded thing, louder than it had in months. The next morning, Henry stepped carefully through the blackened ruins. The tools were warped and unrecognizable. His blueprints had turned to dust. A lifetime of work, charred down to silence. He made his way back to the porch and sank down on the top step. Behind him, the house stood quiet. The shed remained untouched, steady. And ahead of him, just the wide, empty sprawl of a gray Montana sky. For the first time in a long while, Henry found himself completely unsure of what to do next. But somewhere beneath the ashes, beneath the weight of loss and sleepless nights, something small and stubborn remained. A flicker, a memory, tiny hands wrapped around a warm bowl of soup. A quiet voice that still echoed in his mind. This has been healing for all three of us. He didn't have a roadmap. He had no plan. But he still had that moment. And for now, maybe that was enough. 2 days after the fire, the snow returned. It came soft and steady, blanketing the charred remains of Henry's workshop like a shroud of mercy, hiding the jagged, blackened edges beneath its gentle weight. From the porch, Henry sat and watched it fall, a steaming cup of coffee cupped in his hands. His knees still throbbed from the frantic rush to save what couldn't be saved. Sleep had barely touched him since. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a memory coming to visit. Every shadow near the shed made his heart jolt. He kept telling himself, "I'll rebuild. I'll start again." But the drive? It hadn't arrived. Not yet. He was just finishing his second cup when he heard something. A faint sound, almost too quiet to notice at first. The soft crunch of footsteps pressing into new snow. He froze. Carefully, he set his mug down. Then rose, crossed the room and peered through the frosted window. And there, emerging from the curtain of falling flakes, came a figure he hadn't dared hope to see again. Clara. She wore a thicker coat this time, dark blue, cinched at the waist. Her hair had grown longer, pulled into a loose braid that swayed as she walked. But it was unmistakably her. And behind her, bundled in scarves and oversized hats, trudged two familiar shapes. Between them, they pulled a red wagon whose wheels dragged through the heavy snow. Henry's heart skipped, then pounded. He stepped out onto the porch, breath catching just as Clara reached the steps. She looked up. Neither of them spoke at first, because sometimes I say more than words ever could. In hers, he saw everything: resolve, tenderness, and unspoken apology. And something else. Hope. The girl stopped beside her, cheeks red from the cold. Mia waved eagerly. Sophie stood taller, gripping the wagon handle with pride. Henry squinted slightly, finally noticing what they'd brought with them. Wood, tools, a couple paint cans, and a battered old lunchbox. He looked at Clara, blinking hard. "You came back," he said, the words dry and unfamiliar in his mouth. She gave a soft smile. "We heard about the fire. Ruth told me." Henry let out a breath, somewhere between a sigh and a chuckle. Of course she did. But there was no irritation in his voice, only quiet, overwhelmed gratitude. Clara reached out and gently touched his sleeve. "I couldn't stop thinking about this place. About you. About how you made us feel safe when we had absolutely nothing." Her voice trembled, eyes shining despite the cold. "We wanted to come home." That word home hit him like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled outward, reaching corners of him that had long been closed off. "You sure?" he asked, voice catching. Clara's response was calm and steady. "I've never been more sure." Behind her, Sophie cleared her throat like a tiny drum roll. "We brought tools," she announced. "Mama says we're gonna help rebuild everything." Henry glanced back at the wagon again. It wasn't much: some hammers, a box of nails, maybe a few brushes. But to him, it was everything. He knelt in front of them, his breath a cloud in the air. "Well," he said, voice warmer than it had been in days, "looks like we've got ourselves a crew." The girls squealed with delight and raced past him up the porch steps, giggling as they barreled into the house like no time had passed at all. Clara lingered, her breath rising in a soft puff between them. "I left," she said quietly, "but I never stopped wondering if I should have stayed." Henry met her eyes. Now, with a steadier breath, she added, "I want to be where we're needed. And right now. I think that's here." Henry didn't say anything right away. He just reached for the door and opened it wide. This time, Clara stepped inside without hesitation. The warmth inside greeted them like an old friend. The girls immediately got to work, pulling out blankets, talking over each other about what had changed, what they remembered, and where everything used to be. Clara set the lunchbox on the table and popped it open. Inside, she'd packed a neatly folded cloth, 2 peanut butter and honey sandwiches, 3 apples, and a metal thermos. "I wasn't sure if you'd eaten," she said quietly. Henry let out a soft laugh, his throat tight. "You always did show up with good timing." The 4 of them sat down together around the table, as if no time had passed at all. The food was simple, nothing fancy, but every bite tasted like belonging. Later that afternoon, Henry guided them out to the remains of the workshop. The scent of scorched pine and damp ash lingered in the cold air. Snow had started to retreat again, revealing splintered beams, blackened boards, and a tangle of rust-colored nails. The girls stood side by side in silence, their hands clasped tightly. "I'm sorry," Mia whispered, barely audible. Henry knelt down beside her, his voice low and gentle. "Nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. It's just wood, and wood can be rebuilt." Clara moved slowly through the wreckage, her boots crunching softly over the debris. She paused beside a charred post, laid her hand against it. "This," she said quietly, "this is where we begin, and this time we build it better." That night, once the girls had fallen asleep, curled up in their pajamas on the couch, breathing slow and even, Henry and Clara sat outside again, side by side on the porch. The sky stretched above them, scattered with stars, sharp and silver in the cold, quiet dark. Henry passed her a mug of cocoa. She smiled as her hands wrapped around it. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said. They sat for a while in silence. Then Henry glanced over at her. "You didn't have to come back, you know." "I know," Clara replied softly. "But I wanted to. Because you showed me what it means to feel like you belong somewhere, and I want to give that back." Henry turned toward her fully now. "What if we mess it up?" he asked. "What if we don't get it right?" Clara leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "Then we just keep trying," she said. "Together." And in that moment, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Henry didn't feel like an outsider watching his life pass him by. He felt like he was finally living it. They started rebuilding the next morning. There were no blueprints, no formal plans, just 4 pairs of willing hands and the quiet resolve to make something whole again. Henry and Clara tackled the heavy lifting, clearing out the last of the scorched wreckage, shoveling out splinters, rusted nails, and soot-covered debris. Wheelbarrows full of ash made their way to the edge of the property, one trip at a time. The girls insisted on helping, even though their gloves slipped off constantly and their boots were always a size too big. Sophie swept the porch like she'd been born in the wrong century, her tongue sticking out in full concentration, while Mia hummed softly, organizing the salvageable nails into a coffee can, one by one. "Teamwork makes the dream work," Clara said, wiping sweat from her brow and grinning. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Did you read that off a coffee mug?" "Bumper sticker," she replied proudly. "Still counts." They laughed, not politely, not out of habit, but the kind of laugh that fills a space and settles into the bones. It echoed against the shed, carried into the trees, and softened something inside them both. By the week's end, the ground was clear and ready for new lumber. Henry made a supply run into town. When he came back, he found the kitchen full of life, music playing low from the old radio, the scent of cinnamon hanging in the air. Clara stood at the counter, guiding the girls as they baked. Mia pressed dough with both fists, determined and serious. Sophie was enthusiastically throwing flour everywhere, most of it landing anywhere but the bowl. Clara turned her head and smiled. "Hope you don't mind. We're baking." Henry set the bags down and smirked. "You sure this isn't a flour explosion?" Clara grinned. "Call it creative chaos." He watched the 3 of them for a while, not saying anything. Just letting the moment breathe. There was something sacred in the way they moved together, easy, unhurried, at peace. Something that didn't need a name. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep beneath a blanket fort in the living room, Henry sat across from Clara at the kitchen table. They were quietly sorting nails into jars, the soft clinks filling the space between them. Clara broke the silence. I was thinking, maybe we could turn the shed into something. Henry looked up. Like what? Maybe a small workshop, she said, her tone thoughtful. A little corner for the girls to do crafts, a table for you, a space we all share. A place that belongs to all of us. Henry smiled slowly. All of us, huh? Clara didn't back down. Only if you want that. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. I do. She nodded. Then let's make it real. The following days passed in a blur of sawdust, simple dinners, and shared laughter. Henry taught the girls how to hold a hammer, firm but gentle. Clara painted wooden signs for every shelf they installed: hope, grit, kindness. One afternoon, she surprised him with a small chalkboard above the doorway. In clear, bold letters it read, Whitaker and Company. EST 2025. Henry stood in the doorway, staring at it, throat tight. You don't like it? Clara asked, her voice soft. He shook his head. No. I love it. What struck him most was that company didn't just mean business. It meant not being alone anymore. That night, with the dishes done and the house quiet, Henry stepped outside and found Clara already on the porch swing, legs tucked under a wool blanket. He sat beside her. Above them, the sky was crystal clear, stars cold and brilliant. She didn't speak at first, just sipped her tea, the old swing creaking gently beneath them. Then she asked, do you ever think about starting over? Like, really starting over. Not just fixing what burned, but building something entirely new. Henry was silent for a while. I used to think I couldn't, he said finally. Like moving forward meant I was letting go of what I'd lost, my wife, my little girl. Like starting again would somehow erase them. Clara turned her head toward him. And now, she asked softly. Henry let out a breath, steady and quiet. Now I'm starting to think that remembering and holding on aren't the same thing. And maybe building something new is the best way to honor what used to be. Clara reached for his hand under the blanket. He let her take it. He let her hand stay in his. Her thumb gently traced the back of his rough knuckles, no pressure, no urgency. Just presence. And that, he realized, was love? Not a sudden spark. Not fireworks or grand gestures. But a quiet flame tended slowly, ember by ember. Spring didn't announce itself with blossoms or green shoots, it crept in through the air. Through the sound of water dripping from the roofline. Through the soft squelch of thawing mud beneath boots. Through the timid chirps of birds testing their songs after a long silence. Snow receded in patches, uncovering last fall's leaves pressed flat like forgotten pages. Inside the workshop, no longer Henry's alone, but there's sunlight streamed through the windows, catching in the air where sawdust danced like golden dust motes. The walls were fresh with paint. The shelves had filled again. And in the middle of the room, Henry stood focused at a workbench, hands moving over smooth wood. He wasn't building just any table. He was making one for four. The idea had arrived quietly, like most good ones do. It happened one evening after dinner, with everyone squeezed around the kitchen table. Mia had pointed out, we don't really fit here. Clara had laughed and said, guess you'll just have to shrink. But Henry had already noticed it, that subtle dance of shoulders and knees. The way Clara angled her seat, always giving the girls extra space. The way he shifted back in his chair without thinking. That night, he'd made a decision. No more making room. It was time to make a place. Over the next 3 days, he brought that decision to life. Pine for the tabletop, soft, warm, full of character and knots that told their own little stories. Oak for the legs, strong, steady. A clear finish, no decorations, no fancy touches. Just solid, honest work. Built for the kind of family that understood both loss and love. When the table was done, he asked the girls and Clara to wait outside. Why? Sophie asked, bouncing on her toes. Is it a surprise? It's a table, Henry said with a shrug and a grin. Don't expect too much. You're acting suspicious, Mia said, squinting up at him. I'm just being practical, he teased. Still, they waited. And when he finally opened the door, sunlight poured across the floor like a blessing, landing right on the new table. The girls were the first to react. It's huge, Sophie gasped. Clara stepped forward, her voice low but certain. It's beautiful. Henry scratched the back of his neck, suddenly sheepish. I figured. Maybe we needed one that fit all of us. Mia ran a small hand along the edge, her eyes wide. It's warm, she said softly. It's wood, Henry replied, chuckling. She shook her head. No, it feels warm. Clara moved closer, her fingers joining Mia's as they traced the smooth grain. You built this for us, she said. He nodded slowly. If that's still what you want. Their eyes met, and in that stillness, something clear and unspoken passed between them. I want that, she said. That night, the new table saw its first meal. Roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, and more laughter than the room had heard in years. Sophie knocked over her water. Mia lost her spoon twice. Clara lit candles anyway. Henry sat at the head, watching it all unfold. His heart full. His hands still dusty from the day's work. This feels like a holiday, Clara said as she poured cider into mismatched cups. It is, Henry replied. It's the day we stopped eating in borrowed corners. Later, after the girls were tucked beneath quilts and the candles burned down low, Henry stayed in the kitchen as Clara dried her hands by the sink. I've been thinking, he began, his voice hesitant, about permanence. Clara looked at him, quiet but open. This house, he said, was meant for three. Me, my wife, and our daughter. And for the longest time, I didn't think it could hold anyone else. I thought letting someone new in would feel like replacing them. Her gaze softened. Henry, but then you came, he continued, and you didn't take anyone's place. You found your own. She stepped closer, saying nothing, waiting. I don't have a ring, he said. I'm not sure this is the right moment, but I made something I can give. Something real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on blue velvet, lay a key. Clara blinked. It's the spare for the front door, he said. I want you to have it. Not because you need it, but because I want you to know. This house is yours, too. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and smiled, even as her eyes welled up. I don't need a ring, she whispered, but I think I'll hold onto that key. Henry reached out. She took his hand. Outside, the last of the snow melted just a little faster. And inside, something else, something quieter, deeper, had started to grow. 1 year later, on the first warm morning of spring, Henry opened the shed door and let the light pour in. Sunlight swept across the floor like liquid gold, touching the boards they'd laid together so many months ago. The space had transformed. Gone were the rusted tools and drafty corners. The scent of old hay had been replaced with the fragrance of paint and pine. Now, shelves lined the walls, stacked with bolts, buttons, mason jars, and brushes. A small table stood in the center, messy with crayons and half-finished art. It wasn't just a shed anymore. It was a beginning. Out in the yard, Clara knelt in the soil, loosening it with gloved hands. She wore a wide straw hat. Her braid draped down the back of her denim shirt. Sophie and Mia ran barefoot through the grass, chasing each other with sticks turned fairy wands. Henry stood in the doorway, arms crossed. For the first time in forever, the quiet in his chest wasn't loneliness. It was peace. A bird sang from a nearby tree. A single daffodil bloomed beneath the window. The wind no longer bit. It carried the smell of growing things. Clara stood up and waved. I think the earth finally forgave the frost. Henry smiled. Or maybe it was just waiting for you. She walked over, brushing dirt from her hands. The girls want to build a flower box, she said. I told them to ask the boss. Henry nodded toward the shed. Tell the crew I'll draw up some plans. That evening they gathered around their table. For plates. For forks. For voices tumbling over one another like a familiar melody. After dinner, Sophie and Mia curled up on the couch with a book. Henry and Clara stepped out onto the porch, their tea warm in their hands. The sunset painted the sky with soft gold and rose. The kind of light that makes you believe something sacred is watching, just behind the clouds. Henry turned to her. I've been thinking about how it all started. Clara tilted her head. You mean us? He smiled. No. The day I found you in the shed. Her expression softened. I thought I was the one rescuing you, he said. But looking back, I think I was the one being saved. She squeezed his hand. We saved each other. He glanced down at their fingers, woven together like something stitched slowly by hand. A little uneven but unshakably strong. I still go out there sometimes, Henry said. Just stand in the doorway. Remember what it was and what it became. Clara's voice was a murmur. Do you miss the quiet? He shook his head. Not even a little. The breeze shifted. Warm pine on the air. And something else baking? Probably one of the girls' dessert experiments. Likely chaotic. Probably wonderful. Clara turned toward him. What do we call this? This life? He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the fields. At the house that once held only echoes, now filled with laughter. We call it home, he said. Clara nodded like she'd known that all along. That night, after the lights were low and the kitchen quiet, Henry walked out to the shed one more time. The stars above blinked down like silent witnesses. He stood in the doorway, now framed with ivy and the first lilacs of spring. He breathed deep paint, wood, soil, life. On the far shelf sat the old soup pot, gleaming now, untouched but never forgotten. It had earned its place. Pinned beside it was a child's drawing. For stick figures, smiling. And above them, our family. Each had a name. Clara, Henry, Sophie, Mia. Beneath them, scrawled in orange crayon, underlined 3 times. Forever. Henry smiled. He stepped into the shed and flicked on the small light overhead. It flickered, then shone bright and steady. The shed, once a place of cold and survival, now glowed with warmth and purpose. Because sometimes the harshest winters lead into the gentlest springs. Not with thunder, but with quiet love, patient kindness, and a seat at the table for someone who never believed they'd have one. If this story found a place in your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if stories like this, full of hope, second chances, and quiet miracles, speak to you, consider subscribing and staying a while longer. From all of us here, thank you for being part of this story.